It's funny. We hear so much about political division all the time.
It's constant.
But maybe not always just between the parties, but like deep inside the parties themselves.
Yeah, that seems to be getting more intense.
It really feels like the battle lines are shifting, getting kind of complex.
Yeah.
Fascinating, really.
Absolutely.
And what happens when, the outsider suddenly becomes the insider? Or when these internal party fights kind of overshadow everything else?
Good question.
Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into that, specifically into the Republican Party's own, let's call it an internal civil war, trying to understand what's really going on behind the headlines.
That's the plan. Our mission today is really to give you a shortcut, help you get properly well-informed on this whole dynamic landscape. We'll look at how political endorsements are changing, how powerful they still are, and we'll definitely dig into those intense internal conflicts you mentioned. Plus, we'll spotlight a really unique figure, Representative Thomas Massie. He kind of mixes traditional conservative ideas with libertarian principles, and looking at him helps shed light on the party's, its ongoing evolution and where it might be heading.
Yeah, and we've pulled together a pretty good stack of sources for this deep dive. We've got political analyses, some expert opinions, even looked at what people are saying on online forums to get that, public sentiment angle. Gives us a nice rounded view.
A holistic perspective, exactly.
Okay, let's jump right in then. So endorsements, let's start there. When some big-name, high-profile figure backs a candidate, does it actually, move the needle? Or is it mostly just, political theater for the media?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Kostas Panagopoulos, he's the head of political science at Northeastern. He suggests endorsements usually only make a difference primarily at the edges and in very close races. Does that track with what you've seen? Seems a bit underwhelming given the hype.
It does track, actually. I mean, the public perception is often that, an endorsement is this magic wand, but the data, it backs up Panagopoulos. It's more nuanced, and we see this playing out big time with former President Trump. Sure, he still has, majority support among Republican voters in quite a few polls, and his endorsements have definitely helped candidates win in House and Senate races, lots of them, but it's also been a mixed bag. You got to look at the whole picture.
Right. Like what?
Well, take the 2022 Georgia primary. Trump went all in, backing David Perdue against the incumbent governor Brian Kemp. But Kemp won. And interestingly, Kemp had Mike Pence's endorsement, the former vice president.
Ah, okay. So not a slam dunk.
Exactly. The key thing here, the real insight, is that even with a super loyal base, that Trump endorsement isn't always a guaranteed win. It depends on the state, the candidate, the context.
What I found really interesting, though, in the source material was this whole shift in Trump's role. Because he burst onto the scene as, the ultimate anti-establishment guy, right?
Yeah.
Disruptor in chief.
That was his brand.
But now, now, in a lot of ways, he is the Republican establishment.
Right.
He sets the tone. Nick Beauchamp, another political science professor at Northeastern, he points out that this dynamic, it actually creates more space for voters in the Republican primaries to back candidates that Trump hasn't endorsed.
Yeah, that's a sharp observation.
It's a fascinating sort of redefinition of influence, isn't it?
It really is. It fundamentally changes the landscape for primaries. But, to offer a counterpoint to that Georgia example you brought up, look at J.D. Vance in Ohio. The sources describe him as a former never-Trumper.
Right, I remember that.
But then he, the source says he abased himself, which is strong language, but basically means he really, really publicly reversed course and aligned himself hard with Trump to get that endorsement. And in his case, it seemed to make a difference. It helped him clinch the Senate nomination.
So that muddies the waters a bit.
It does. It raises this really important question. How much of this is about pure, deep-seated loyalty to Trump? And how much is just tactical positioning? Candidates seeing the power of the endorsement and just doing what they think they need to do to get it.
Good point. Strategy versus belief.
Exactly.
And, this whole dynamic around endorsements, it's not just a Republican thing, even if it looks different elsewhere. Our sources mention similar stuff on the Democratic side, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, though it's maybe less focused on one person. The sources say it's not just about one figure like Trump, but more like establishment Democrats clashing with a fairly coherent left-wing insurgency from the Sanders faction.
Ah, okay. The progressive versus moderate wing.
Right. So internal fights are happening in both parties, just maybe with different flashpoints and figureheads.
That makes sense. And Nick Beauchamp, the professor we mentioned, he kind of ties this all together with a broader point. He sees the U.S. political landscape now as basically split into 4 parties, not just 2.
4? Okay, how does that work?
Well, within the GOP, he sees the Trump faction, which is the larger group right now, and the non-Trump faction. And both of these are becoming more distinct, more coherent in their own right.
Huh. Like 2 sub-parties within the Republican Party.
Kind of. And the Democrats have their own internal divisions, too, as you said. The core idea here, and this is really key for you, the listener, to grasp, is that we're not just talking red versus blue anymore. We're seeing this fundamental realignment where the fights within the parties are sometimes just as significant, maybe even more so, than the fights between them. It makes that old school political analysis feel a bit, well, outdated.
Yeah, that 4-party idea really resonates when you look at the headlines. And that internal division, that brings us right to what our sources are calling the internal conflicts and power struggles that have become hallmarks of the modern GOP.
Hallmarks, yeah. Strong word.
It is. And they suggest these fights are making effective governance virtually impossible, even when Republicans have control. It's not just disagreements on policy details. It sounds like it's actively stopping things from getting done.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And we see some really concrete, frankly, kind of shocking examples of this dysfunction playing out across the states. It shows just how intense these internal battles can get.
Like what kind of examples?
Okay, so in Ohio, you had Republicans basically splitting the state house leadership into rival camps. Total paralysis. Because of all the infighting, they only managed to pass like 10 bills in a whole year.
10 bills. That's incredibly low.
Right. One Republican state representative, Sarah Carruthers, she flat out called the situation childish.
Yeah.
That's a pretty strong condemnation coming from inside the party, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then, get this. In Michigan, a county party chair reported being literally kicked in the crotch by a rival during a party meeting.
Well, seriously, kicked.
That's what the source reported. I mean, talk about things getting physical. It's not just shouting matches.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Arizona. Democrats managed to sweep the statewide races there, partly because, as the sources put it, insurgent Republicans won their party's primaries. The idea being maybe these primary winners were strong with the base, but less appealing to the broader electorate in the general election.
So winning the primary battle, but losing the general election war, potentially.
That's the dynamic suggested there. And then Texas, oh boy. The Republican Attorney General, Ken Paxton, after he got impeached by the GOP-controlled state house, he actually considered bringing criminal charges against members of his own party.
Against fellow Republicans.
Yeah. It just paints this picture of really extreme internal tension and breakdown of trust.
And this isn't entirely out of the blue, is it? The sources give some historical context here. They mention an aggressive wing of activists challenging the establishment going way back to Newt Gingrich becoming Speaker in '95.
Right, it's not brand new.
And we saw it with the Tea Party movement, too. It feels like a recurring theme, maybe just getting more intense now.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's intensified. And what's really fascinating here, according to the sources, is the contrast with the Democrats. While Dems definitely have their own fights, progressives versus moderates, the sources say they have seen nothing like the perennial GOP internal clashes.
Huh. So why does this seem more pervasive or destructive in the Republican Party?
That's the core question. The sources suggest one big factor might be the Republican base itself being more opposed to compromise compared to Democratic voters.
The C word. Compromise.
Exactly. For a lot of conservatives, especially at the grassroots level, compromise isn't seen as like pragmatic politics. It's often viewed as selling out, as betraying core principles.
Okay, I can see how that would lead to conflict.
Yeah, that kind of ideological rigidity, maybe combined with the strong sense of grievance among certain groups within the party, it just creates fertile ground for these repeated internal struggles. It's described in one source as a civil war that has been happening since 2015, really picking up steam when Trump arrived.
Civil war. Wow.
Yeah. And it's portrayed sometimes as this coalition of the resentful, think white Christians, working class voters, maybe feeling left behind, versus what's called the coalition of the ascendant, like immigrants, younger folks, college grads. These are pretty deep-seated clashes over identity and the future of the country, not just minor policy tweaks.
Okay, so within this really complex, often kind of chaotic picture, let's zoom in on one person who seems to embody a lot of these tensions. Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky.
Massie. Yeah, he's a perfect case study.
He's often seen as this libertarian in Republicans' clothing, right? Gets compared to Ron Paul a lot. He really shows you what this internal party struggle looks like on the ground in Congress.
Absolutely. And the sources paint a really vivid picture of him. He's got these deeply held principles described as a constitutionalist, voluntarist, minarchist libertarian.
Whoa, that's a mouthful. Break that down.
Huh, yeah. Yeah. Basically, it means he believes in the absolute minimal amount of government possible, maximum individual liberty, sticking strictly to the Constitution. He's known for voting no on pretty much anything that expands government power or spending.
Okay. Principled no man.
Pretty much. And his lifestyle reflects it, too. He's an MIT graduate, believe it or not, but he lives this very independent, off-the-grid life, built his own self-sufficient, solar-powered, 1,000-acre homestead, uses Tesla batteries, apparently.
An MIT grad off the grid.
Okay, that's unique.
It really is. And what's striking is, even though he's described as being a bit apart from self-described anarchists, his very radical government-shrinking approach seems to yield more tangible results in Congress than you might expect. He's effective in his own way. And he's definitely not afraid to go against the grain, even against the biggest figures in his own party. Like in March 2025, there was that big spending bill to avoid a government shutdown.
Right, I remember that drama.
Massie was apparently the only vote Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson lost on that bill. Just him standing against the tide. That takes guts, especially when Trump is involved.
It absolutely does. And Trump's reaction was swift and pretty brutal. The sources detail it clearly. Trump publicly denounced him, called Massie a grandstander, a pathetic loser, and maybe the most cutting remark for a Republican right now, not Maggie.
Oof, not Mago. That's basically casting him out, isn't it?
It's a clear signal, a loyalty test. And it didn't stop there. Trump's political operation actually launched a whole new PAC called Kentucky Maggie, specifically to target Massie in his home state.
Wow, so crossing Trump definitely comes with a price tag.
A big one.
Yeah.
But Massie keeps doing it, which suggests his stance is based on, deep conviction, not just political calculation.
But here's the really interesting part, right? His constituents back home in Kentucky, they seem to stick with him.
That's what the sources indicate, yeah.
One constituent, Donna Williamson, was quoted saying his willingness to stand up to Trump actually strengthens her support for him. Another, Rob Houchins, just called him a man of principle.
High praise in politics.
Even a Democratic voter, Kim Harper, called what he did courageous. That cross-party respect is pretty rare these days. It suggests that for some voters, maybe that consistency, that conviction, matters more than just towing the party line, even in our super polarized times.
It really does suggest that.
And just on a more personal, somber note, one of the Reddit sources we looked at mentioned the recent tragic news that Massie's wife, Rhonda, passed away in June 2025. She'd apparently been battling cancer for 14 years.
Oh, that's incredibly sad news. Thoughts are certainly with him and his family. And what's also fascinating about Massie, and speaks volumes about his unique appeal, is his ability to maintain that popularity while navigating these clashes, and his unusual friendships. Yeah, the sources mention him being cool with AOC. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Wow, really? That's an unexpected pairing.
Right. While also having this, quote, weird friendship with MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, it just further highlights how he seems to operate based on principle or maybe personal connection rather than strict party lines. He attracts support from people who value that integrity, maybe regardless of the usual political labels.
Okay, so we've got these intense internal dynamics, this civil war, figures like Massie pushing boundaries. What does it all mean for the future? Where is the Republican Party actually heading? Our sources had some interesting and sometimes kind of conflicting predictions on this.
Yeah, there are definitely different takes on what a post-Trump GOP might look like, or even a second Trump term GOP, and how it might evolve. Some folks suggest a future centered around family-first capitalism, think cultural conservatism mixed with certain economic policies. Figures like J.D. Vance are floated as potential nominees in that model, maybe with someone like Nikki Haley or even Tulsi Gabbard as a VP pick.
Okay, so culture and economics intertwined.
Right. Then others predict more of a shift towards pro-worker conservatism, really trying to lock in those blue-collar, maybe even union families that have been moving towards the GOP.
How would they do that?
By focusing heavily on things like American manufacturing, energy production, and exploration of natural resources, a more populist, economic nationalist approach. Jim Jordan's name even gets mentioned as a possible presidential contender in 2028 under that kind of framework.
Interesting. Jordan as the face of pro-worker conservatism.
That's one idea floated. And then there's this broader trend some sources see, suggesting the party might actually become less religious, surprisingly, and more focused on fiscal conservatism again, maybe becoming more libertarian overall.
Less religious, how?
The thinking is that maybe groups like Hispanics, Indians, Asians might shift more Republican based on things like traditional family values and meritocracy principles rather than purely religious ones. So the coalition changes. It shows a party really wrestling with its identity, trying to figure out what the next winning formula looks like.
There was also one source that laid out a very specific kind of conditional path to long-term power for the GOP.
Oh, yeah. What was the condition?
It suggested that if a potential Trump administration and congressional Republicans could actually deliver on a specific list of goals, things like lower taxes, fewer regulations, reducing the size and scope of government, reducing the deficit and balancing the budget, plus a peace through strength, foreign policy, lower inflation, and like 4% economic growth, then they will be in power for a generation.
Wow, that's a big if list. That's basically the traditional conservative wish list right there.
Exactly. It sets a really clear but very high bar based on delivering concrete conservative policy outcomes.
And, tying it back to Thomas Massie for a second, he had this interesting reflection once. He was talking about the voters who supported him and Ron Paul, and his observation was that they weren't necessarily voting purely for libertarian ideas.
No. What were they voting for, then?
He suggested they were often voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the race, his words, meaning the person most willing to shake things up, to challenge the status quo most aggressively.
Okay, that's a memorable quote.
It is. And then he kind of wryly added that in that specific category, Donald Trump won best in class, which raises this really important question, I think, for the party's future and maybe for you, the listener, to chew on. In the end, what matters more? Is it the carefully crafted policy platforms, the detailed plans, or is it that captivating, maybe convention-defying personality that ultimately dictates political success and really shapes where a party goes, policy or personality?
That's a great question to ponder. So just to recap our deep dive today, we looked at the real, often nuanced power of political endorsements, not always the silver bullet people think.
Right, more complex than it seems.
We dove into that intense, sometimes bitter civil war happening inside the Republican Party, making governance really tricky.
Yeah, the dysfunction is palpable sometimes.
And we saw how figures like Thomas Massie embody this principled, often anti-establishment stand, even clashing with the party's biggest names, including its populist wing.
A real maverick figure showing those internal fault lines.
And for you, the listener, the big takeaway, hopefully, is that understanding these deep currents within the party is just crucial if you want to truly get the bigger political picture beyond just the daily headlines.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the shifting ideas, the power struggles, and how the very meaning of conservative is being debated and reshaped right now. That's what's really shaping our government and our future.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given all these deep internal divisions we talked about, the different predictions for where the party might go, and the appeal of unique figures like Massie who just don't fit neatly into boxes, what does conservative truly mean in American politics today? And maybe more importantly, how might that definition keep evolving in the years ahead?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Something to definitely keep thinking about.